The plate left Gideon Vale's hand before Ruth Ann Callahan had taken off her coat. It struck the stone wall beside the stove and burst into white shards. Sam Vale flinched so hard his shoulder hit the doorframe. Marta Reyes lowered her eyes. Jonah Pike, who had carried Ruth's trunk in from the wagon, went still with both hands hanging at his sides. Outside wind scraped dry snow across the porch boards. Inside the stove smoked faintly from a bad draft, and the broken plates spun once on the floor before falling flat. Gideon did not apologize. "The last woman who cooked in this kitchen made my boy sick for 3 days," he said. His voice was low and dry, more dangerous for the lack of shouting. "Meals are served when I say. My rules are followed. If you can't manage that, you'll find your own way back east." Ruth stood with her carpet bag in one hand and a dented recipe tin pressed beneath her other arm. She was tired from the train to Missoula and the long freight ride north. But tiredness had never made her foolish. She looked at Gideon. He was taller than she had expected, broad through the shoulders, iron gray at the temples, with the worn face of a man who had spent more years facing weather than people. Anger sat naturally on him, as if he had carried it so long his bones had shaped themselves around it. Ruth set down her bag. "Marta," she said, "may I have a broom?" Marta looked at Gideon before moving. "I asked her," Ruth said, "not you." Gideon's jaw tightened. "You should understand how serious I am." Ruth shifted the recipe tin to the table and met his stare. "You can throw every plate in Montana, Mr. Vale. It still will not frighten supper onto this table." Jonah made a sound that might have been a cough. Gideon looked at Ruth for a long moment. She could almost see him searching for the fear he expected. When he did not find it, he turned toward the back door. "Coffee at 5:30, he said. "Breakfast at 7, supper at 6. The door slammed behind him. Sam disappeared from the doorway. Marta brought the broom. "He's worse when he's frightened," she said quietly. "That explains it," Ruth replied, sweeping the largest pieces together. "It does not excuse it." 3 days earlier, Mission Valley had first appeared beyond the freight wagon as a wide sweep of pale winter grass beneath the white wall of the mountains. Ruth had never seen land so beautiful or so indifferent. Joseph Allard had driven the wagon north from Missoula. He was a Métis freighter with a fur-lined coat, steady hands, and the habit of studying people before he spoke. "Vale runs good cattle," Joe had said. "Keeps strong fences, pays on time." "That sounds like praise," Ruth had answered. "It is. And what did you leave out?" Joe's mouth had bent slightly. "He thinks control is the same thing as safety." Clara Finley, a Salish widow riding beside Ruth for part of the journey, had looked toward the mountains. "Winter does not create weakness in a house," Clara had said. "It only finds what was already cracked." Ruth had carried those words with her all the way to Three Rivers Ranch. Now, standing in its kitchen, she could see the cracks. The stove drew badly on the left. The cast-iron skillet had gone gray from neglect. Flour sat in a sack near the damp wall. The herb shelf held salt, pepper, and almost nothing else. Through the window, empty flour boxes clung beneath the porch rail, their soil hard as stone. At the back of the pantry, behind canned beans, she found 2 jars of choke cherry preserves. A faded paper label carried a woman's careful handwriting. Evelyn Vale, August 1882. Ruth held 1 jar toward the window. "Those belong to his wife Marta," said from behind her. "Sam's mother." Ruth returned the jar exactly where she had found it. "I won't touch them." Marta watched her face, searching for curiosity or rivalry. Ruth gave her neither. A small sound came from the kitchen door. Sam stood there in a flannel shirt too large through the shoulders. His dark hair needed cutting. His eyes were the eyes of a child who had learned that rooms could become dangerous without warning. He stared at the recipe tin. "What's in that recipes? From where everywhere I've lived long enough to learn something." Ruth opened the lid. Cards filled the box, some yellowed, some stained with grease, some written in ink that had faded to brown. Sam pointed to one. "Who wrote that?" "My grandmother." "Is she dead?" "Yes." He looked at the cards again. "Then why keep them?" "Because being gone and being useless are not the same thing." He considered that with great seriousness. "Are you going to leave?" Ruth could have offered comfort. It would have been easy. It also would have been dishonest. "I haven't decided whether this house deserves me yet." His eyes lifted to hers. For the first time, something besides caution moved through them. By late afternoon, Ruth knew what supper would be. The pantry offered navy beans, salt pork, a small piece of venison, 2 onions, cornmeal, molasses, dried sage, and a jug of milk beginning to sour. It was not much, but little had never frightened her. She soaked the beans in hot water, browned the venison and salt pork in the restored skillet, then added onions and sage. Molasses went in last, only enough to deepen the flavor. Sam returned with a school book tucked beneath one arm. "You need something?" Ruth asked. "No." "Then you may sort these beans." He stared at the bowl. "I don't know how." "Bad ones to the left, good ones to the pot." He sat. His fingers moved slowly at first. "The last woman wouldn't let me help," he said. "Why?" She said, "Children make messes, adults make larger ones." He glanced toward the broken plate piled beside the stove. Ruth pretended not to notice. When the sour milk skillet bread was ready to mix, she showed Sam how to work the dough without beating the life out of it. "My mother sang when she made bread," he said. "What did she sing? I don't remember." His hands stopped. "I remember her laughing. It was loud. That is worth remembering." The other women said they'd stay. Ruth folded the dough once, then put his hands back on it. "I won't promise what I have not decided. That doesn't sound nice." "No," Ruth said, "but it is true." By 6, the storm had thickened against the windows. Gideon entered with snow on his shoulders and anger in his face. Jonah followed him carrying a coil of wire. The smell reached them first. Beans, venison, onions, hot bread. Gideon stopped. The table had been set. Sam had folded the cloth crookedly beneath the breadbasket, but Ruth had left it that way. She served the stew. Gideon took one bite. The room became silent. He took another. Sam watched him, then began eating. After the 3rd spoonful, the tightness left his shoulders. Marta remained standing near the stove. "There is a chair," Ruth told her. Marta looked at Gideon. He did not object. Jonah cleared his throat from the doorway. "Mr. Vale, we've got trouble on the East Meadow." Ruth set another bowl on the table. Gideon glanced at it, then at Jonah. "Sit down before it gets cold." Jonah obeyed. The silence that followed was not empty. Spoons touched bowls, bread tore beneath working hands, wind pressed against the house, but the kitchen held its warmth. Only after Gideon had finished half his meal did he ask, "What trouble?" "2 boundary stones are gone," Jonah said. "Cutter's cattle are over the spring line." Gideon put down his spoon. He moved them. "Joe Allard thinks the old survey notes may prove it." Gideon rose and reached for his coat. Ruth looked toward the window where the snow had swallowed the barn. "The meadow will still be there in the morning. This is ranch business. It will become funeral business if you ride into that storm angry." His face hardened. "You think you can tell me what to do in my own house?" Ruth stood. "Because a wife who cannot tell the truth is only a servant wearing a ring." The word wife hung between them. Gideon looked at Sam. The boy had stopped eating. Slowly, Gideon released the coat. Hours later, when the house had gone quiet, Ruth found him in the kitchen taking another piece of bread. She was returning Evelyn's preserves to the pantry. "She gathered those with Clara Finley," he said, "every August. I won't open them without asking." He studied her less like a stranger now and more like a question he had not prepared to answer. "Cutter will come back," he said. "Men like him don't move stones unless they mean to move something larger." After he left, Ruth stood by the window. 3 riders appeared along the eastern ridge, black shapes against the snow. One dismounted beside the fence. The figure bent low near the wire. Ruth reached for the lantern. By the time its light touched the yard, the rider had vanished into the storm. 3 weeks after Ruth saw the rider bend over the eastern fence, the kitchen at Three Rivers Ranch no longer smelled like cold iron and old smoke. It smelled of coffee before dawn bread by mid-morning, and whatever Ruth had decided the day required by afternoon. The change had not happened dramatically. No one had announced it. It had come through repetition. Every morning at 5:30, Gideon found his coffee waiting. Every evening at 6, Sam found a place set for him. Marta had stopped standing in the doorway, as though the kitchen were territory under threat. She now worked beside Ruth, though she still corrected the position of every cloth Ruth folded. Jonah had begun appearing at the back door with questions that were not always about food. Gideon stayed at the table longer, sometimes only a minute, sometimes 5. He still spoke more easily about broken hinges than people. He still checked the stove after Ruth banked the fire, as if trusting her completely might invite fate to punish him. But he no longer watched her with the certainty that she would fail. That morning, Ruth was kneading bread when Clara Finley arrived carrying a basket of dried berries and 2 small jars of winter salve. Clara shook snow from her shawl and studied the room. "It sounds different," she said. Ruth pressed the dough forward with both palms. A kitchen has a sound every room does. Marta was mending a torn apron near the window. She did not look up. "This one used to sound like people waiting for bad news," Clara continued. Ruth folded the dough. "And now it sounds like people expecting supper." Sam grinned from the table where he was copying figures from an arithmetic book. Clara noticed. Her expression softened. Later, while Marta carried linens upstairs and Sam went to the barn, Clara helped Ruth sort dried chokecherries. "Evelyn had a recipe box," Clara said. Ruth's hands paused. Gideon's wife, Clara, nodded. "Wooden. Cedar, I think. She wrote everything down. Biscuits, preserves, remedies for fever. Marta packed it away after Evelyn died." "Does Gideon know?" "He knows it existed. Knowing where it is would require asking." Ruth resumed sorting. "I won't go looking for it." Clara studied her. "You are careful with him. I am careful with grief. Those are not always the same thing." Ruth looked up. Clara's voice remained calm. "Patience is good. Endurance can be good. But a woman should not turn either one into permission." Before Ruth could answer, carriage wheels sounded in the yard. Lenora Cutter entered without waiting to be invited. She wore a fitted blue coat with black fur at the collar and gloves too fine for ranch work. Her eyes moved across the kitchen, taking in Clara Marta, the rising dough, and Ruth's flour-dusted sleeves. "So Lenora said you are still here." Ruth wiped her hands. "You sound disappointed." Lenora smiled without warmth. Surprised, she placed a folded document on the table. "My husband's deed. The eastern meadow belongs to his family." Clara remained near the stove. Marta had returned and stood behind Lenora, silent as stone. Ruth did not touch the paper. "That sounds like business for Gideon. It concerns you more than you understand." Lenora's gaze traveled over Ruth slowly. "You have made yourself useful, I will grant you that. A warm stove, fresh bread, a boy who has someone to listen to him. Men can mistake comfort for affection when they have been cold long enough." Ruth met her eyes. "And women can mistake bitterness for wisdom when they have carried it too long." A flush rose beneath Lenora's powder. "Gideon loved Evelyn. He will never love another woman. I did not come here to erase a dead woman. I came because the living were hungry." The back door opened. Joe Allard entered with a sack of flour over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw Lenora. "Mrs. Cutter, Mr. Allard." Joe set down the flour and examined the deed without asking permission. "This map is wrong," he said. Lenora stiffened. "It was copied from county records. The spring bends north here." Joe tapped the paper. "On this map it bends west. A surveyor who had walked the land would not make that mistake. Lenora snatched up the deed. "My husband will settle it with Gideon." At the door, she turned to Ruth. "When Gideon loses that meadow, he will need someone to blame. I wonder how brave you will seem then." She left before Ruth could answer. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to iron. Wind came down from the mountains, driving snow sideways across the yard. Gideon and Jonah rode north to move cattle into shelter. Joe left for St. Ignatius to look through old survey notes. Clara remained because the storm was worsening too quickly for safe travel. Sam stood at the kitchen window watching a young bay mare circle the eastern paddock. "She was my mother's," he said. Ruth glanced outside. "Then she has good reason to be difficult." Sam smiled. A hard gust struck the house. Somewhere beyond the barn, wood cracked. The bay mare bolted. By the time Ruth reached the window, the animal was already through the eastern fence, running toward the spring meadow. Sam was gone from the kitchen. His wool scarf was missing from its peg. So was the rope by the back door. Ruth's heart dropped. She ran outside and shouted his name. The wind threw it back into her face. Gideon returned 20 minutes later with Jonah, both men white with snow. When Ruth told him something, and Gideon's face collapsed and hardened at once. "You let him go." "I did not see him leave. You were supposed to be here. I was here. He trusted you." The chair beside him went over with a violent crack. Marta flinched. Gideon pointed toward the door. "Every woman who comes into this house brings trouble with her." Ruth stepped between him and the doorway. "Do not mistake my patience for permission to wound the people I have chosen to protect." His anger stopped as if it had struck a wall. "You may blame me after we find him," she said. "Until then, you will stop shouting and listen." His chest rose hard beneath his coat. "Move! No! Fear has made you useless before. It will not make you useless now." Jonah looked away. Marta did not. Ruth began giving orders. "Jonah, take the barn road. Gideon, follow the eastern fence. Clara, heat blankets and stones. Marta, keep lanterns burning at the house and stable." The door opened behind them. Joe entered, bent against the wind. "What happened, Sam?" "Followed the bay mare," Ruth said. "Toward the spring." Gideon grabbed his rifle and coat. "You stay here," he told Ruth. "No, this is not a debate. Sam may answer my voice before yours." The truth of it struck him. He looked away first. Ruth rode with Joe. The storm erased the world beyond the horse's head. Cottonwoods appeared and vanished like ghosts. Snow filled the tracks as soon as they were made. Near the spring, Joe raised one hand. A strip of rope hung from the fence wire. He dismounted. The wire had been cut cleanly. "This was no storm," he said. Ruth stared toward the cottonwoods. Then she heard it. A boy, coughing. They found Sam curled beside the bay mare, his coat spread partly over the animal's injured leg. His lips were blue. Gideon reached them moments later. "What were you thinking?" he shouted, dropping from his horse. "You could have—" "The boy does not need your fear dressed up as anger," Ruth said. "He needs his father." Gideon froze. Then he fell to his knees in the snow and pulled Sam against him. For the first time, Sam saw his father cry. They brought him home, wrapped in blankets. By midnight, fever had set in. Gideon paced while Clara worked. When he questioned her for the fourth time, Ruth caught his arm. "Control did not save Evelyn," she said. "It will not save Sam." He stared at her. Then he sat down. Near dawn, Sam's fever broke. His eyes opened. "Ruth, I am here." Gideon heard her. That evening, Joe laid the cut wire on the kitchen table. Jonah had seen one of Cutter's riders near the meadow before the storm. Gideon reached for his rifle. Ruth blocked the door. "If you ride there angry, you give them exactly what they want." Joe opened an old leather journal he had brought from St. Ignatius. "My father carried freight for the first survey crew," he said. "He wrote about a buried marker near the spring, 3 chisel cuts beneath a split cottonwood." Gideon looked toward the dark eastern window. Outside, the storm had finally passed. At dawn, they would search the meadow for the truth hidden beneath the snow. Before dawn, the eastern meadow looked like a white country without roads. Ruth rode between Gideon and Joe Allard, while Jonah followed with the shovels tied behind his saddle. The storm had passed, but the cold it left behind was sharper than wind. Each breath stung. The horses broke through crusted snow to their knees, and the sound carried across the valley like splitting boards. Behind them, Three Rivers Ranch lay dim beneath the mountains. Clara remained with Sam, whose fever had broken, but whose strength had not yet returned. Marta had packed bread, coffee, and blankets without being asked. Gideon had objected when Ruth saddled her horse. "You nearly froze finding him yesterday," he said. "So did you." "This is different." "No," Ruth answered. "It is the same land, the same danger, and the same family. I have earned the right to see what we are fighting." He had looked at her a long moment and then tightened her saddle strap himself. Now Joe rode with his father's journal open across one gloved hand. "Split cottonwood," he said. "Spring Bend like a hook. Red Cliff east by northeast. Marker buried where the old line crosses the water trail." "The cottonwood may be gone," Jonah said. "Then we look for what remains." They reached the spring after sunrise. Steam rose from the open water, pale against the dark trunks. Snow had swallowed the fence line and softened every shape that might have mattered. Joe dismounted beside a fallen cottonwood. This could be the tree. "Could be?" Gideon asked. "It has been nearly 30 years. Trees do not promise to wait for men." They searched in widening circles. Jonah probed the ground with an iron bar. Gideon followed the creek bank. Joe compared the journal's description to the red cliff visible through the trees. Ruth stood near the spring and watched the water. The current had shifted over time, but one bank remained exposed where warmth from the spring kept the earth from freezing solid. Roots twisted from the mud beneath a leaning stump. "There," she said. Gideon looked over. "The journal says the marker was buried near the water trail. If the creek moved, the bank may have uncovered what the snow hides elsewhere." Jonah drove his shovel into the softened earth. The blade struck stone. They cleared the mud with their hands until a flat gray marker emerged beneath the roots. 3 deep chisel cuts crossed its upper face. Joe knelt and laid his palm against it. "This is it." Gideon said nothing. He looked toward the missing surface stones, then at the open spring, then back at the marker, as if the land itself had finally spoken in a language no man could dispute. Jonah uncovered scrape marks in the frozen ground several yards away. "Someone dragged the newer stones out," he said. "These marks were made by tools." Hoofbeats sounded beyond the cottonwoods. Amos Cutter rode into the meadow, with Lenora beside him and 2 hired men behind them. Amos's face hardened when he saw the marker. "You have no right digging on my land." Joe stood. "Your land does not extend past this stone." Lenora urged her horse forward. "That journal proves nothing. The marker does," Joe said. "So does the creek line, the cliff bearing, and the original survey notation." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. Jonah pointed at him. "That is the rider I saw by the fence." The man's face changed. Lenora turned sharply. "Keep your mouth shut." Amos looked from his wife to the hired rider. "What did you do?" The rider swallowed. "Mrs. Cutter paid me to move the stones, said no one would find the old one. She told me to loosen the eastern wire too." Amos went pale. "You cut that fence! I did not know the boy would follow the mare." Lenora's voice snapped across the meadow. "No one told him to ride into a storm." Ruth stepped closer. "People who create danger do not get to choose who suffers from it." Lenora looked at her with naked hatred. "You think this makes you mistress of that ranch? You are a cook in a borrowed dress. Gideon keeps you because you feed his boy and warm his bedchambers. When he no longer needs you, he will remember what you are." Ruth did not move. Lenora's gaze traveled over her heavy coat and broad figure. "You are too old to give him another family, too plain to make him forget Evelyn, Too soft for this country." Gideon stepped between them. His voice was quiet. "She did not come here to replace the dead. She came here and reminded the living that they were not dead yet." Lenora stared at him. Gideon continued, "Ruth is my wife. She stands beside me because I choose her there. Evelyn's memory is not an empty chair for you to claim, and honoring her does not require me to bury the rest of us with her." The meadow went still. Amos looked at Lenora as though he no longer recognized her. He removed his hat. "The claim is finished," he said. "I will pay for the fence. And the spring trail stays open," Joe said. "Families have used it longer than either ranch has carried a name." Gideon looked toward the water. "It stays open." He could have reached for his rifle. He could have demanded punishment with his hands. Instead, he told Jonah to mark the stone for the county surveyor. That choice mattered more than victory. On the ride home, Gideon said little. He led Ruth into the barn before they entered the house. The air smelled of hay leather and warm animals. "This is where Evelyn first fell sick," he said. "She had been helping families through the fever. 3 weeks later, she was gone." Ruth waited. "Afterward, I thought loving someone meant giving fate another place to strike. So I tried to control everything. The ranch, Sam, the house, you." "You cannot control loss," Ruth said. "You can only decide what kind of man it finds when it comes." He looked at her. "I cannot promise I will never die," she continued. "I cannot promise never to disappoint you, but I will promise this. I will not leave simply because you make yourself difficult to love." His breath caught. "But if you throw another plate over, turn another chair, or use fear to rule this house, I will go. Understanding your grief does not require me to live beneath your anger." Gideon nodded. "I understand." That evening, he repaired the chair he had overturned when Sam disappeared. Marta watched him fit the broken rung into place. Then she climbed to the attic and returned carrying a cedar box wrapped in linen. "Evelyn's," she said. Inside were recipe cards, preserve labels, biscuit instructions, and notes about Sam as a baby. Ruth placed the cedar box beside her dented tin. "Two histories can share a shelf," she said, without either one disappearing. Sam, pale but smiling, asked for a blank card. He copied the bread from Ruth's first supper in careful printing. Before Christmas, Clara brought evergreen branches for the empty porch boxes. She and Ruth pressed them into the frozen soil. "They will hold until spring," Clara said. That night, Ruth sat across from Gideon in the kitchen. "I will not stay as a housekeeper called a wife," she told him. "I need to know whether you want me, not merely what I do." He struggled for the words, but she did not rescue him. Finally, he placed his hands flat on the table. "I listen for your steps before dawn. I notice when you leave a room. I want your opinion even when it troubles me. I have begun thinking about spring because you speak as if we will both be here to see it." He reached across the table. "I do not only need you, Ruth. I want you here." She placed her hand in his. At Christmas supper, Jonah brought smoked venison. Clara brought chokecherry sauce. Marta made corn cakes. Sam carried in his first loaf of bread with both hands. His recipe card read, "Sam Vale's winter bread made the first year Ruth stayed." "The first year we became a family," Ruth corrected. Gideon nodded. 3 mornings later, Ruth came downstairs at 4:15 and found the kitchen full of smoke. Gideon stood beside a weak fire, ash on his sleeve, staring at a pot of coffee thin enough to see through. Ruth began to laugh. He stiffened, then looked at the ruined fire, the pale coffee, and her face. Slowly, he laughed too. Sam appeared in the doorway and stared at his father as though witnessing something impossible. Gideon poured Ruth a cup. It was terrible. She drank it anyway. Outside, winter held the valley hard beneath its hand. Inside, 2 recipe boxes rested side by side, and Sam's new card lay between them. The house had not forgotten winter, but at last it remembered how to expect spring.